So, tonight we take up the 15th chapter in the Life Divine, the Supreme Truth Consciousness, published on the 15th of October in 1915. So here we're moving from a general description of the supramental consciousness, which we covered in the last chapter, to a description of its summative nature. And the next chapter that we get to will break it down farther into the three aspects of the supramental consciousness. So tonight, it's Supreme Station. And as always, he begins with a motto, this one taken from the Mandukya Upanishad, which is part of the Atharva Veda collection. One of the shortest, I think it is, in fact, the shortest of the great Upanishads. And it reads, "One seated in the sleep of superconscience, a masked intelligence, a masked intelligence, blissful and the enjoyer of bliss. This is the omnipotent. This is the omniscient. This is the inner control. This is the source of all." Now, when the Arya published this chapter, it only had the second part. This is the omnipotent. This is the omniscient. The first part was added when he went back and revised the Life Divine. One seated in the sleep of superconscience, Sushupta Sthana. Sushupta is that, not dream, but the deep sleep state of the Supreme Self, when it has not subjectivized or objectivized itself. It is an impartite oneness. So it is prior to manifestation, prior to the conceptive view of the supramental. A masked intelligence, prajnana gana. So now we have the sense of something that's moving out. The prajnana, as Sri Aurobindo will describe it, is the apprehending aspect. It's the consciousness that reaches out. Maybe we should pause here for a second and look at a little bit of the Sanskrit vocabulary. We're using terms which come from a root word jna, J-N-A, and the N has a little wiggle over it, which means to know. Prajnana means to go out and get knowledge. Vijnana is the great knowledge. Jnana, by itself, is essential knowledge. So let's keep these terms close to us. So when Sri Aurobindo uses these terms in reference to the supramental, he means different shades of connotation by them. He's telling us different things about the nature of that supreme awareness. So first, it is in this state where it is masked in an impartite oneness. There is only that. You can't even say there's one because it takes many to be able to refer back to one, yes? So it's even prior to that. And then there is this masked intelligence, prajnana gana, which means gana means brought together. Chidgana means the great consciousness, all compressed, concentrated within itself. Here it's prajnana. It's consciousness which can go out and apprehend that which it seeks. It is blissful, anandamaya. It is the enjoyer of bliss, anandabhuj. And then this is who we call the omnipotent, sarveshvara. This is what we call omniscient, sarvajna. This is the inner control, antaryaman. This is the source, the yoni, the womb of all. That's what it says, yoni. This is the source of all. And this is the Mandukya Upanishad, about which the great Karika was written by Gaudapada to, in a sense, establish the school of Advaita Vedanta. And already we have the reference to the yoni, to the womb of massed consciousness, which gives birth to this teeming multiplicity which we call the universe, out of a true consciousness. So the universe, even according to the Mandukya Upanishad, is wonderfully real and not elusive. That may be an elusive concept for the Advaitins to accept. I should be shot, I know. So, let's begin. He opens by saying, we have to regard, therefore, this all-containing, all-originating, all-consummating supermind as the nature of the divine being, not indeed in its absolute self-existence, but in its action as the Lord and Creator of its own worlds. So, all-containing, that's the comprehending aspect of the supramental consciousness, what we could call the Vijnana. We have an all-originating status of the creative impulse of the supramental, and we have an all-consummating, which is the prajnana aspect of the supermind, all of which compose the nature of the divine being, as it emerges in self-expression from Satchit Ananda, which is the best that we can do to try to understand what is that which is beyond all definition. So, but in its action, he says, as the Lord and Creator of its own worlds. So, we have moved out of the sleep of superconscience into the active poise, and when there is action, then there can be a Lord. Before there is any movement, there is no Lord. Lord and Creator of its own worlds. Obviously, he writes, this is not the too personal and limited deity, the magnified and supernatural man of the ordinary occidental conception, for that conception erects a too human eidolon of a certain relation between the creative supermind and the ego. Eidolon is just the Greek word for image. So, in other words, frankly, the sentence suggests that God is created in our image and not the other way around, the way that we think about God. We just multiply the figure of a man to this furry fellow in the sky with a big white beard who looks like us, thinks like us. He gets mad, he gets jealous, and that is hardly the image of what the divine is in its own personality. It's too human a rendering. It is an image, and no image can capture the entirety of what that is. Even if it were a good rendition, you would fail to capture it. He goes on, we must not indeed exclude the personal aspect of the deity, for the impersonal is only one face of existence. The divine is all existence, but it is also the one existent. It is the sole conscious being, but still a being. Nevertheless, with this aspect we are not concerned at present. It is the impersonal psychological truth of the divine consciousness that we are seeking to fathom. It is this that we have to fix in a large and clarified conception. So again, getting to precisions, getting to good definitions that we can rely upon. So this is, in a way, an answer to the Advaitins by suggesting that this great conscious being is a person, is a being after all, not just a homogenized existence. But that is not our real focus here. We're here not to talk about the person, but to talk about the nature of existence and what this supramental existence is like. By the way, the divine is all existence, sarva bhutani. Again, he's borrowed that phrase translated into English from the Bhagavad Gita, which again is a theistic text. So, this is what our job is tonight, to understand what is the nature of the truth consciousness. So, the truth consciousness is everywhere present in the universe as an ordering self-knowledge by which the one manifests the harmonies of its infinite potential multiplicity. We'll come upon this idea of the potency, the power, the possibilities teeming inside this one conscious being again and again. So, what is potential comes from the Latin potens, to be able to do. So it is this oneness which manifests multiplicity within itself, but always held, as he suggests, in a harmony. Without this ordering self-knowledge, and what would be ordering here but the Rita Chit, the real idea which the supramental has as it takes the vastitude of that Satchit Ananda and begins to organize it for self-expression in a developing cosmos. Without this ordering self-knowledge, the manifestation would be merely a shifting chaos, precisely because the potentiality is infinite, which by itself might lead only to a play of uncontrolled, unbounded chance. Where that dash is, where that M dash is, that last bit, which by itself might lead only to a play of uncontrolled, unbounded chance, Sri Aurobindo wrote later and inserted into it, just to make sure we understood what he was trying to say. Because we might in several ways interpret that sentence, so he narrowed it down for us. If there were only infinite potentiality, without any law of guiding truth and harmonious self-vision, without any predetermining idea in the very seed of things cast out for evolution, the world could be nothing but a teeming, amorphous, confused uncertainty. So we have an idea here again that we have to look at, a predetermining capital idea. Predetermined means decided beforehand. So in this self-vision that the supramental awareness has, as it's drawing from Satchidananda, getting ready to cast it out, it determines already in its conceptive idea what's going to happen. So it will not be confused, it will not be chaotic, it will not be uncertain. But, he writes, the knowledge that creates, because what it creates or releases are forms and powers of itself, and not things other than itself, possesses in its own being the vision of the truth and law that governs each potentiality. And along with that, an intrinsic awareness of its relation to other potentialities and the harmonies that are possible between them. It holds all this prefigured in the general determining harmony which the whole rhythmic idea of the universe must contain in its very birth and self-conception, and which must, therefore, inevitably work out by the interplay of its constituents. So there's a consciousness of the whole, W-H-O-L-E, which governs each idea in its particularity, holds it within its context, but also governs the interplay of each with the all with the each, so that there is an inherent harmony, no possibility of discord, because this is one being, even when it becomes multiplied. So there is balance, there is, you might say, the just motif the perfect force applied to each movement so that the harmony of the whole is not disrupted in the going forth. Then he says, well, before we go farther, he writes, in the general determining harmony. Now we said above that predetermined means decided beforehand. Now we need to probably understand that the idea of determinism is going to come up again and again. We're talking about a determinism in the consciousness of the supramental. And determinism simply means that every event happens just as it must. That from the point of causation to the next event and the series of events that follow that, each thing must follow its determined course. Because it must be so. It is inevitable. So he continues, it is the source and keeper of law in the world. He's talking about that knowledge of the supramental that creates, that brings things out. As it creates, it establishes an order, a law, and maintains it. It is the source and keeper of law in the world, for that law is nothing arbitrary. It is the expression of a self-nature which is determined by the compelling truth of the real idea that each thing is in its conception. Therefore, from the beginning, the whole development is predetermined in its self-knowledge and at every moment in its self-working. It is what it must be at each moment by its own original inherent truth. It moves to what it must be at the next, still by its own original inherent truth. It will be at the end that which was contained and intended in its seed. So this is a determinism at the divine level. This is a conscious determinism, and not the idea that we have when we view it from the human side of things, that I can't help it because events made me what I am, and whatever I decide, I've been determined to do that, etc., etc. As if we have no choice. We're instruments driven along. Remember, this is occurring within the deep and supreme consciousness of the one reality. It cannot experience discord, it cannot experience division, because all occurs within it. This is a supreme harmony which wants to express itself, and which, Sri Aurobindo notes, is embedded at the very basis of the cosmos, suggesting that even if we can't see it, the will that's nascent in this supramental origin of things is operative here in the universe as well. And even if things don't look pretty, don't look happy, don't look auspicious, they are headed inevitably in a direction which will lead to the end result that it conceived. As he says, it will be at the end that which was contained and intended in its seed. And the supramental is seated here. So have a little faith. This development and progress of the world according to an original truth of its own being implies a succession of time, a relation in space, and a regulated interaction of related things in space, to which the succession of time gives the aspect of causality. Time and space, according to the metaphysician, have only a conceptual and not a real existence. But since all things, and not these only, are forms assumed by conscious being in its own consciousness, the distinction is of no great importance. Time and space are that one conscious being viewing itself in extension, subjectively as time, objectively as space. Our mental view of these two categories is determined by the idea of measure, which is inherent in the action of the analytical dividing movement of mind. Let's pause and look at some of what he said so far. So the development and progress arise from the own being of the divine. And own being is a translation of swabhava into English, that word that we meet very often and very pregnantly in the Bhagavad Gita. It's a relation in space, is this development. Now, space is a hard thing to define. Sri Aurobindo was writing about space and time in 1914. You cannot presume that he had a close acquaintance with Albert Einstein's theories about space and time, especially since many of them developed later. But you can see in the successive sentences and paragraphs here, Sri Aurobindo is trying to fuse these two in an all-encompassing reality that unite space and time, that they are extensions of actual being of the supramental consciousness for the purpose of a developing world. They form a kind of backdrop. Now, the classical way that we think of space, from Democritus onwards in ancient Greece, it says a void in which things are placed. Aristotle didn't accept that. To him, it was a manifold in which things are placed, rather to say that the universe is a finite plenum, space being an aggregate of all the physical things that exist. Thus, space exists, where all these physical things are. And to bring it up to date, all the way to nearer our time, to Kant, space was not a thing in itself, not an actuality, but sort of a ground upon which all was impinged. So, the idea of space in Kant being infinitely divisible, in some senses goes back to the atomism of Democritus, but in some ways is free of it as well, because it's not really bound up in the laws of the universe. It's sort of the ground upon which the laws of the universe are imposed. The idea that time and space are something conceptual we owe to George Berkeley. That's his sense of things. We think of Sri Aurobindo as never having read philosophy, but we have been meeting in many of these pages recently some acquaintance with modern philosophy indeed. He seems to know something about Berkeley, something about Hume, something about Descartes, etc. So he may have simply absorbed it, or he may actually have read it. To continue, I'll reread that sentence. Our mental view of these two categories, again, time and space, is determined by the idea of measure, which is inherent in the action of the analytical dividing movement of mind. So in other words, time and space come into existence for us when we start chopping things up, when we start on the process of measurement. That means between A and B. That means A and B can't be the same thing, they must be different. Therefore, we can measure them. This event occurred, that event will occur. Let's see what we can do about that. So time, he writes, is for the mind a mobile extension measured out by the succession of the past, present, and future, in which mind places itself at a certain standpoint whence it looks before and after. So there's this stretch of time, and to the mind, it stands somewhere in between, and it looks back at what occurred, and it looks forward at what might occur or will occur. Space is a stable extension measured out by divisibility of substance. At a certain point in that divisible extension, mind places itself and regards the disposition of substance around it. So, mind again is interposing itself in the extension of space and experiences it by placement, by particularizing itself, just as it does in the flow of time. Time might be uninterrupted, but the mind sits down in the middle of time and says, behind me is the past, in front of me is the future. And in space, it sits down and says, in front of me is what's in front of me, and behind me is what is behind me. He continues, well, and this is rather a classical definition of what space is. In actual fact, Sri Aurobindo writes, mind measures time by event, and space by matter. And nothing can be more obvious to that. You know, our practical intelligence works like this. We're aware of what happened, and then we're aware of the next event that happened, and we can string them together, but the temporal space in between, we're not particularly paying attention to. We're focused on the action and not on the ground of time in which it's set. So we don't see that. So he continues, but it is possible in pure mentality to disregard the movement of event and the disposition of substance and realize the pure movement of conscious force which constitutes space and time. These two are then merely two aspects of the universal force of consciousness, which in their intertwined interaction comprehend the warp and woof of its action upon itself. So, he's speaking here about how the mind can regard time and space. So it is possible, even for the mind, to pull back in its purity from this immediate particularity of temporal or spatial placement and regard it more broadly, as if from above, so that one can see the ground of the Chit Shakti. When he says conscious force, again, that is an English translation of Chit Shakti. Chit is that aspect of Sat Chit Ananda, bringing itself forward through its own power into manifestation, drawing what is real out into expression. It is what figures itself through the supramental force as the creative consciousness. So, let me reread that. In actual fact, mind measures time by event and space by matter, but it is possible in pure mentality to disregard the movement of event and the disposition of substance and realize the pure movement of conscious force which constitutes space and time. These two are then merely two aspects of the universal force of consciousness, which in their intertwined interaction comprehend the warp and woof of its action upon itself. And to a consciousness higher than mind, which should regard our past, present, and future in one view, containing and not contained in them, not situated at a particular moment of time for its point of prospection, time might well offer itself as an eternal present. He's referring here to the supramental consciousness, the Trikala Drishti, the awareness, the consciousness of the vision of the three times, which is one, an unbroken whole. Past, present, and future are one moment to it, to the supramental. It should regard all as one. It should contain and not be contained. So even if it moves into its apprehending aspect, where it goes out to experience something particular, it does not lose itself as still maintaining its posture as the container, because the supramental cannot be divided. It is impartite. The term prospection, it just means looking to the future, because it sees the all, or every moment, as one. And, he writes, to the same consciousness, not situated at any particular point of space, but containing all points and regions in itself, space also might well offer itself as a subjective and indivisible extension, no less subjective than time. Again, this is contra Aristotle, well and good. So his point is that both space and time are centered, or possibly centered, in the awareness of things, which is real. So space can be a subjective experience, just as our sense of the passage of time is a subjective experience. So, then he says, at certain moments, we become aware of such an indivisible regard, upholding by its immutable self-conscious unity the variations of the universe. An indivisible regard, upholding the variations of the universe. This is shading close to Newton's idea that the universe is the sensorium of God, an actual extension of its divine being, an objectification, you might say, of the Godhead. But we must not now ask how the contents of time and space would present themselves there in their transcendent truth. For this our mind cannot conceive, and it is even ready to deny to this indivisible any possibility of knowing the world in any other way than that of our mind and senses. So the mind cannot know, cannot see what that is, but it would still tell us that our experience of it would be implausible and inadmissible in a court of knowledge. Ha. So then we're ready for the next paragraph. What we have to realize, and can to a certain extent conceive, is the one view and all-comprehending regard by which the supermind embraces and unifies the successions of time and the divisions of space. Presumably this is that aspect of knowledge which is vijnana in his terminology. Because it is all-comprehending, it is the ground of all being, and unifies the whole, to ensure, in a sense, that nothing can occur, nothing can be placed outside its being. And first, if this were not this factor of the successions of time, if there were not this factor of the successions of time, there would be no change or progression. A perfect harmony would be perpetually manifest, coeval with other harmonies in a sort of eternal moment, not successive to them in the movement from past to future. Now, if you want to have a progressive, a developing universe, you must allow things to move. If everything happens all at once, in that eternal moment, there is no universe. There is no play. We have instead the constant succession of a developing harmony in which one strain rises out of another that preceded it and conceals itself and conceals in itself that which it has replaced. So there is, in the notation of the music, that which rises and then falls, giving way to the next instrument which rises and then falls, allowing that to develop. Or, as he says, if the self-manifestation were to exist without the factor of divisible space, there would be no mutable relation of forms or intershock of forces. All would exist and not be worked out. A spaceless self-consciousness, purely subjective, would contain all things in an infinite subjective grasp, as in the mind of a cosmic poet or dreamer, but would not distribute itself through all in an indefinite objective self-extension. So it's a similar problem when we regard space as with time. If everything happens in one moment, nothing is allowed to develop lengthily. If everything happens in a particular point or pointless state of existence, then again, there's no objectification of the being. One is not allowed to inform existence. Or again, he writes, if time alone were real, its successions would be a pure development in which one strain would rise out of another in a subjective, free spontaneity, as in a series of musical sounds or a succession of poetical images. We have instead a harmony worked out by time in terms of forms and forces that stand related to one another in an all-containing spatial extension. An incessant succession of powers and figures of things and happenings is our vision of existence. So in other words, space and time work together to form the moving context of the universe so that there can be a progression, there can be a hiding and a discovery, there can be an involution and an evolution. Now, those of you who like to know what was in Arya as opposed to the later revision, above in that phrase, in a subjective free spontaneity, it read originally pure spontaneity. Clearly he wanted to make certain that we understood that this was the inner reflection in the supramental consciousness. And below, where it says, in an all-containing spatial extension, it used to read, an all-containing extension. He wanted to make sure that other possibilities were eliminated by defining that, by pinning that down. So the idea of the subjectivity of time and the spatiality of space, he wanted to make sure that we understood what he was talking about. That last phrase, an incessant succession of powers and figures of things and happenings, is our vision of existence. He added that. So, then, different potentialities are embodied, placed, related in this field of time and space, each with its powers and possibilities fronting other powers and possibilities. And as a result, the successions of time become in their appearance to the mind a working out of things by shock and struggle, and not a spontaneous succession. In reality, there is a spontaneous working out of things from within, and the external shock and struggle are only the superficial aspect of this elaboration. So what seems to us to be an outer process in which all things are determined in the most external way is actually different. The real determination is inner. it pre-exists, it's prefigured in the inner awareness of the supramental as it begins to unroll the determinations of the cosmos. But recall this, that self-conscious single being is acting freely to create the world. So there is freedom at the beginning and there is victory at the end. So what occurs in the middle we have to regard as part of the purposeful play that the Divine Mother enters into as she brings all this forth, the multiplicity out of her oneness. To continue with Sri Aurobindo, for the inner and inherent law of the one and whole, which is necessarily a harmony, governs the outer and processive laws of the parts or forms which appear to be in collision. And to the supramental vision, this greater and profounder truth of harmony is always present. So we see colliding forces in beings, we see things at cross purpose, and we think that's the way that it is, and we judge the universe negatively. But to the supramental consciousness, it knows exactly where everything is going, why it's in its current state, and where it will be delivered to. That which is an apparent discord to the mind because it considers each thing separately in itself is an element of the general ever-present and ever-developing harmony to the supermind, because it views all things in a multiple unity. Remember, that is its nature. It comes out of the oneness of Satchit Ananda. Everything exists within it, so cannot be discordant, cannot be divided, may only be differentiated. At the core of each being and each event is a real idea guiding it forward. Its conclusion is inevitably victorious. It must be self-fulfilling. But we divide things in terms of space and time into short little bits that we can understand. How far can the mind see? How far can the senses grasp? Not very far. And so we run out of patience, we run out of vision, we run out of consciousness. We cannot understand what this endless eternity is and how much there is at play. What are the real frontiers? They are only inner. So the supermind's multiple oneness is undisturbed because it feels the permanent harmony underlying the development. So let's see. I think we next take up this sentence. Besides, the mind sees only a given time and space and views many possibilities pell-mell as all more or less realizable in that time and space. The divine supermind sees the whole extension of time and space and can embrace all the mind's possibilities and very many more not visible to the mind, but without any error, groping, or confusion. For it perceives each potentiality in its proper force, essential necessity, right relation to the others, and the time, place, and circumstance, both of its gradual and its ultimate realization. To see things steadily and see them whole is not possible to the mind, but it is the very nature of the transcendent supermind. Remember, the title of the chapter is The Supreme Truth Consciousness. So, This supermind, in its conscious vision, not only contains all the forms of itself which its conscious force creates, but it pervades them as an indwelling presence and a self-revealing light. It is present, even though concealed, in every form and force of the universe. So this self-fulfilling law is inside you. You don't have to look for it to come from above. You don't have to look for it to come tomorrow. It is present, as he says, ever present and ever developing, driving you forward even when you don't want to go. It's impelling and compelling your growth through difficulty towards that recaptured harmony. It is that which determines sovereignly and spontaneously form, force, and functioning. So it doesn't have to labor. It arises spontaneously within the supramental. And it does it sovereignly. It rules because it is that. Yes, it doesn't have to gain power over. Power is inherent in it. It is a conscious power, chit shakti, which is at work in the supramental consciousness, directly. It is that which determines sovereignly and spontaneously form, force, and functioning. It limits the variations it compels. It gathers, disperses, modifies the energy which it uses. And all this is done in accord with the first laws that its self-knowledge has fixed in the very birth of the form, at the very starting point of the force. It is seated within everything, as the Lord in the heart of all existences, he who turns them as on an engine by the power of his Maya. It is within them and embraces them as the divine seer, who variously disposed and ordained objects, each rightly according to the thing that it is, from years sempiternal. And now let's stop and look at the quotations, the citations. The idea of the first laws, pratamanu dharma. It's a Vedic expression, he says. The gods act according to the first laws, original and therefore supreme, which are the law of the truth of things. That's from Rig Veda 3:17-4. And he's given the citation for the Gita, chapter 18, verse 61, one of the great memorable verses in the Gita, referring to Ishvara, the Lord. And finally, from the Isha Upanishad. How many times have we been to the Isha Upanishad? Verse 8. And the seer is the Kavi, who is also the poet, who creates, draws out of the rich imagination that is inherent to his consciousness, that which is expressed in beauty, in form. From years sempiternal. The idea, sempiternal from the Latin, suggests not simply what is eternity beyond time, but what is eternity rendered in the movement of time. Everlasting eternity. So the idea that there is some progressive nature in it. Another paragraph. Each thing in itself. Each thing in nature, therefore, whether animate or inanimate, mentally self-conscious or not self-conscious, is governed in its being and in its operations by an indwelling vision and power. To us, subconscient or inconscient, because we are not conscious of it, but not inconscient to itself, rather profoundly and universally conscient. Therefore, each thing seems to do the works of intelligence, even without possessing intelligence, because it obeys, whether subconsciously as in the plant and animal, or half-consciously as in man, the real idea of the divine supermind within it. This is important because that means that everything is working out just as it should. Our judgment be damned. By the way, where you see the term subconsciously, originally Sri Aurobindo had written unconsciously. So whether unconsciously as in the plant, he revised it when he went back, he said, no, plants also are conscious. And what they contain to make them real is this real idea. So the seed concept behind everything in the universe, everything that develops, whether it has direct awareness or not, is this, and that immortal truth is present even in the mortality of the human mind. Thus, there is an implied capacity for us to find that, utilize that, and become that openly, to progress into that. But it is not a mental intelligence that informs and governs all things. It is a self-aware truth of being, in which self-knowledge is inseparable from self-existence. It is this truth consciousness which has not to think out things, but works them out with knowledge according to the impeccable self-vision and the inevitable force of a soul and self-fulfilling existence. Self-aware truth of being. Self-knowledge is the same thing as self-existence. Self-empowerment is the same thing as self-delight. But it works all these things out because we're talking about the process of things now, not the experience, not the rasa that we gather from it, according to an impeccable self-vision. Now, Sri Aurobindo had originally written implacable self-vision, but he wanted to take some of the force out of that term and replace it with something which is perfect. So it is an impeccable self-vision and a force that renders something how? Inevitably. Because all things are predetermined in the self-conception of real being. Mental intelligence, he writes, thinks out because it is merely a reflecting force of consciousness which does not know, but seeks to know. It follows in time, step by step, the working of a knowledge higher than itself, a knowledge that exists always, one and whole, that holds time in its grasp, that sees past, present, and future in a single regard. The beginning of that sentence, the word mental was not there. It read, intelligence thinks out. He wanted to confine that. Mental intelligence thinks out. Back up, and you see in the previous sentence or so, self-aware truth of being has not to think out things. What will I do? Let me make a plan. I'll do A, that will lead to B, and C will come. It has to think out because it's a reflecting force of consciousness. It doesn't know, it's trying to know, so it has to grasp for it. But to the supramental, it does not have to think it out. It simply impels it into being. As he says, a knowledge that exists always. It's one and whole, and sees the whole flow of time as one moment with a single regard. The mind follows, seeking supermind ever, trying to attain that kind of knowledge, trying to attain that kind of mastery, to govern space, to exist through all time. Immortality and mastery and the enjoyment of life, these are all the things that are possible in the play of time and space. But we have to get to the core of reality to understand how to release its true power. When we get to the essence of ourselves, we get to the essence of the universe. So I think this is a good place to pause. And we'll take the rest of the chapter up next time. Next time won't be next week. I'll be in Houston for the weekend, and I'll be meeting with a number of our fellow aspirants there. But we'll take this up 2 weeks hence. Next week, I'll be sending out some recommended reading that you can follow. And of course, there will be a meeting here in Pensacola, but it won't be shared on Zoom. We'll see you in 2 weeks, all my friends there. So, as I said, it's a pregnant pause where we left it. The rest of the chapter we'll take up next time. And as always, we end by saying Jai Ma. Namaste.